Thank you, Congressman Pittenger. I think Ambassador Richmond already made a very persuasive argument why human rights, religious freedom should be part of the national security issue. So today I want to just present you with some recent facts and trends as what's happening in China under Emperor Xi Jinping. First, I was a made in China product. I think maybe the only one in this room. Hopefully it's a good one. And I was born and raised as an atheist under the communism, and then became a student leader in the Tiananmen Square in 1989 on behalf of my students in my university. And then I became a follower of Christ as a Christian under the influence of the American missionaries in our university. And essentially, I went to Beijing after graduate school and became a professor teaching English to the Communist Party leaders as my daytime job. And during the evening and the weekend, I was as busy as any full-time evangelist and pastors in university areas of Beijing. So when the Wall Street Journal interviewed me, they said, "Oh, you're God's double agent." That's the title of my memoir. If you Google Amazon, it's already in 7, 8 languages, called God's Double Agent. And until 1996, both my wife and I were arrested and imprisoned in Beijing for being accused of illegal evangelism. And friends, religious persecution in China today has reached to the worst since the Tiananmen massacre. So since President Xi Jinping took power, he launched 3 wars against the faith. Perhaps no picture is better than this one, if you can have the second, to illustrate the church-state relationship in today's China. And every church is mandated to have President Xi and Chairman Mao's picture being lifted during the Sunday worship services. At the beginning of each worship service, the congregation is mandated to rise up and sing the Communist Party's national anthem before they sing the praises of God. So essentially, Xi Jinping is playing as God in China today. So he launched the 3 wars. The first war he launched is called War Against the Cross. Second, all of a sudden, overnight, a wooden or metal cross is classified as a national security threat, as the enemy of the state. All of a sudden, all the church leaders, local governments, mayors were asked to drive the bulldozers to go to each church to forcefully tear down, burnt down, and took off hundreds of thousands of crosses from the rooftop of the church building. Those church leaders who refused to do that voluntarily were dismissed, fired, Some were even sentenced to 10 to 14 years imprisonment. In the Muslim area in West China, in Xinjiang, as Ambassador Richmond has alluded, the US government and several Western governments, I think including Australia and the UK, has already recognized legally that Xi Jinping's China has committed genocide. The Pentagon has estimated between 1 to 3 million predominantly ethnic Uyghur Muslims, including some Kazakhs, some even Han Chinese, are in the modern-day concentration camps. We at China Aid, as a non-profit human rights Christian organization, had even rescued some survivors from the concentration camps. According to some women, we rescued themselves eyewitness and also victims of Chinese communist regimes systematically organized forced prostitution and gun rape in these concentration camps. So the symbols to recite a verse of Quran in the Muslim mosque in West Xinjiang now is a crime, including the president of the University of Xinjiang, who is a German-educated PhD, was sentenced to life in prison. So the symbols of religious symbols were all of a sudden declared as the enemy of the state. And Xi Jinping launched the second war, the war against God's people. Pastor Wang Yi was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment, a very close friend of mine, for simply preaching on John 3:16, the Gospel of John 3:16, for God so loved the world. When he preached that sermon that Sunday on December 24th, on Christmas Eve, in the city of Chengdu, Sichuan province, he asked President Xi Jinping to repent for his repressive policy against the faithful and even offer the salvation of Christ to him. And for that, he was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment, and over 300 of the believers in his church were arrested. His wife, Miss Jiang Rong, was tortured over 2 years, and their 9-year-old son was separated with both parents. So Pastor Wang Yi is still in prison today. The third war President Xi Jinping launched was the war against the rule of law. You know, President Xi Jinping and his regime leaders, the dictators, they're not only satisfied in suppression to the 1.4 billion Chinese citizens, they are exporting their repression. It's called the transnational repression effort. They are exporting their religious violations model to the country like Burma, like even in Africa. My good friend, a Chinese American, who simply established 16 schools for 2,000 Burmese, the ethnic Kachin minority group children, for them to have an education, a basic education, when the Burmese military government forced them, bombed them to the mountain area. So Pastor John Hall traveled from the US and saw the needs of the education for these children. And for that, he was lured by the Chinese state security agents, literally lured to the border and being kidnapped, and then sentenced him to 7 years imprisonment. 7 years imprisonment. For what? For purely doing charitable work. That's his crime. For educating, for mobilizing the Chinese underground church with the American churches and even the UK churches, supporting 16 schools for these 2,000 children. As a Chinese American with a Caucasian American wife with 2 children, they were never allowed to visit him in the Chinese prison. And Pastor Zhang Tao is still serving prison. It's really the war against the rule of law. It's the transnational repression. And now we all know the Chinese regime has set up 5 overseas police stations in the US soil alone. They set up a police station in Spain, in France, in many other countries. They kidnap not only the Chinese citizens, but also citizens from Canada, from Sweden, from Australia. The CIA told me today in Chinese prison, there are 100 American citizens being held in the Chinese communist jails. So talk about transnational repression. One of my good friends, who is called the Conscience of China, a human rights lawyer whose name is Gao Zhisheng, a 2-time Nobel Peace nominee, just this month marked his 6th year in enforced disappearance. Nobody has heard a word, dead or alive. A Christian human rights lawyer. 6 years after he was already suffering 5 years before his last kidnapping. Tremendous torture. Toothpick. Torture his private parts. So talk about the brutality of the regime. So my friends, I just want to plead with you, if you are in dialogue with your fellow member of parliament, your country, with the Chinese regime, please, I'm not asking you to just say, oh, we disconnect the diplomatic relationship. But simply, I think, number one, just maybe first privately raise these cases. A friend of mine recently, just on July 28th, a human rights lawyer, was kidnapped while on his way to meet his wife and children in Los Angeles. He has a legitimate visa, valid Chinese passport, kidnapped in Laos, in the capital, in Vientiane. Nobody, including his lawyer, has ever been allowed to visit or meet with him. His name is Lu Siwei. If you have a relationship with the Laotian government, please ask the Laotian government, as a country of signature of the enforced disappearance and against torture, signed by the UN signatories, ask the Laotian government, purely from a humanitarian perspective, just allow this human rights lawyer with valid US visa, the US Embassy, US State Department are ready to facilitate, to get him to Los Angeles to reunite with his wife and children. And just tell, really, share with President Xi Jinping and his confidence that actually, for its own benefit, to adhere to the Article 18 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights on protecting religious freedom, it will help actually make their economy more prosperous, it will help get more respect in the international arena, like this situation. And to those, especially who are from Muslim countries, on behalf of the Uyghur Muslim brothers, I'm a Christian pastor, please do a little bit diplomacy with China. When you meet with the Chinese counterpart, speak up for your brothers and sisters. 1 million of them are being tortured. Some are even suffering as the worst. Organ harvesting. So these are some of my pleas. If you don't speak for your brothers and sisters in the concentration camp, who will speak? Unfortunately, the majority of Muslim countries chose to keep silent and quiet, just purely for the benefit of one belt, one road, or maybe some political coverage. I plead to you all, please speak up. Thank you.